Hear these words from the Gospel according to Matthew. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
My first year as a graduate student in Scotland was, to say the least, difficult. When I left home, my mother was fighting cancer and recovering from her 3rd serious operation. I arrived in this strange country and quickly had to adjust to a different academic system, almost a different language, and a climate rather colder than that of South Louisiana. In addition, I fell head over heels for a young undergraduate named Alexandra, who, after a few dates, wrote me this carefully worded note expressing her desire that we be just friends. I suppose you could call it a Dear Jock letter. In that same academic year, in March, my mother died. And that summer, Dad flew over and we made the trip that he and Mother had planned to take. We were 2 vagabonds on the road to Athens. Early in the trip, we visited Geneva, the site of John Calvin's ministry during the Reformation. And one day we made an excursion to Mont Blanc, a mountain in the Swiss Alps. Not the pin, the mountain. I will never forget that day. At the foot of the mountain is a village, beautiful but full of tourists and all the noisy activity that tourists produce. We had our picnic lunch in the graveyard of the little village, the quietest place there, while we waited our turn to get the cable car that would bring us up to the top of the mountain. The ride to the top involves 20 people huddled in this gondola, glass enclosed, dangling for at least 30 minutes from what seemed to me a very skinny little cable. Eventually, we got there, felt the cold wind rushing off the glacier, and walked out and looked down upon the majesty below. The sensation of standing on top of a high mountain is different from that of looking out the window of a plane. In a plane, you feel detached from the earth, free and unencumbered. When you stand on the top of a mountain, you feel a part of the earth, yet literally above it all. The hassle, the troubles, the grief, fly far below. Down in the village, people hawk their wares. The tourists convert their currency to different currency. Children cry, parents bicker, people still suffer, and loved ones mourn. But up here, on this mountain, all of that is forgotten. The air off the glacier is fresh and clean and carries no memories. If only we could stay on top of the mountain and never go back again. Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi is the turning point in the gospel drama. Up to this time, Jesus has been teaching and proclaiming and saying the kingdom of heaven is arriving. But then at Caesarea Philippi, his disciples finally catch on to what his ministry is all about. Who do people say that I am? Jesus asks, and Peter, always the first one to speak up, says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." How easy it is to say that, as we do every Sunday. But what does it mean? Jesus knew, and he told them, it meant that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, that he would be humiliated and abandoned by his closest friends, and mocked and beaten and hung on a cross to die. That's what being the Christ means. And I get the feeling that Jesus didn't know for sure if he might be up to it. Don't you ever have times when you feel that it is all too much to bear? The times, for instance, when your supervisor has been on your case all week, or your teachers seem to have it out for you, they pick on you, your spouse seems preoccupied and distant, your friends are wrapped up in their own concerns and don't seem to have time for you, and you feel you just can't cope with one more day of the same. Do you ever feel like that? Imagine then what Jesus must have felt at Caesarea Philippi when the secret of his messiahship was out and there was no turning back from Jerusalem. If he was truly human, as we say he was, imagine what he felt when Peter called him the Christ and he began his journey toward Jerusalem. So, as though he were searching for the strength to face what lay ahead, Jesus goes from Caesarea Philippi up to an unnamed mountain, Matthew says, a high mountain apart, and with him go Peter and the brothers James and John. And on that high mountain apart, away from the crowds and the cries and all but three of his disciples, Matthew says, a miraculous thing occurred. Jesus' appearance changed. He was transfigured before them. The Greek word is metamorphosis. His face shone like the sun. His garments became white as light. Then Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with him. Now, I don't know exactly what happened on the top of that mountain. Matthew is describing a vision, and being a Presbyterian, I have had very few visions. For my money, the best commentary on the Transfiguration you've already heard through the feet and fingers of Michael Corzine as he played that opening voluntary. I think I know, however, what that vision might have meant for Matthew and his church. Moses is the lawgiver of Israel, And Elijah is Israel's greatest prophets. Together, they represent the law and the prophets. And here they are, conversing with Jesus. The vision means that Jesus is the Christ, the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. His kingdom is dawning with his coming, and one day we shall see him in all his glory. That's what I take to be the meaning of this vision. And if that were not enough, a voice is heard from a cloud, which is always a symbol for the presence of God. And the voice says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." The Transfiguration then is a little foretaste of the world to come, a preview of heaven for Matthew's church, and a vision which assures his disciples of every age that Jesus is the Christ. Perhaps that's also what the Transfiguration might mean for you and me, but I also like what the Scottish theologian and interpreter Willie Barclay said about this story. Perhaps Barclay said the Transfiguration is chiefly for Jesus himself. Perhaps Jesus climbed up that mountain full of anxiety, not sure he was taking the right way. Was he right on how to be the Christ? Was he right about Jerusalem and the cross? Might there be an easier way? First, Barclay says, there came to him the greatest of the lawgivers, and then the greatest of the prophets to tell him to go on. And then greater by far than even that greatness came that voice, which gave him nothing less than the approval of God. The view from the mountain is glorious, full of wonder and adoration and worship. A time to say with Peter, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And like Peter, we want to prolong the vision, to capture it in booths, bask in its glory. But it passes. When, after falling on their faces in awe, the disciples lift up their eyes, they saw nothing but Jesus only. The view from the mountain is glorious, but then the cable conductor says it's time to go back down, and we must descend to the village, back to our old lives, to our supervisors and our teachers and our spouses and our partners and our friends, back to the real world where the cross is waiting. The Christian life is walking with Jesus to Jerusalem, but not without the memory of that view from the top. It's walking with Jesus to Jerusalem and knowing full well what lies ahead, but not without Moses and Elijah walking along, not without that voice assuring us that we are on the right path. It's not in this morning's lesson, but Matthew says that the first person Jesus meets as he comes down the mountain is the man with the epileptic son who begs Jesus to cure his son of his ailment. And before Jesus can even catch his breath, he's back in the world which is so full of pain, the world of people who long for someone to love them, the world which still waits for a Messiah. I wonder, would Jesus have reacted to that man's cry for help in the same way if he had not been on that mountain and seen that vision? And how would we react if we had not been with him? I had a kind of vision of transfiguration once. It was back when Andrew and I were serving a little church in Alta Vista, Virginia. Where else to have a vision than in a town called Alta Vista? Our all-white Presbyterian church had teamed up with the First Baptist Church of Mosley Heights to sponsor a couple of refugees from Haiti. I imagine that these days, under the current president, there wouldn't have been any refugees allowed from Haiti. I remember the day Alphonse and Destin arrived at the Lynchburg airport. Jerry Falwell's plane landed just before they did. They came out clutching their church World Service tickets and very anxious expressions. And after they arrived, we had this, I guess, a housewarming. Actually, it was more like a house reviving. The house we found for them to live in was in terrible shape, and the two congregations came together to do some repair and fixing up. I remember seeing a white Presbyterian engineer and a black laborer planing a door together. I remember a white Presbyterian insurance man cleaning windows for two black Haitian refugees who spoke not a word of English. I saw a white woman scrubbing the floor for two black men, something you did not often see in that part of Virginia. I saw two congregations, but one Church of Jesus Christ, proclaiming that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, in Mosley Heights, of all places. The day after we went to Mont Blanc and came down off that cable car and returned to Geneva, my father and I got the message that back home in Louisiana, my twin sister had undergone lung surgery to diagnose an inexplicable condition. The surgery produced the diagnosis, advanced untreatable cancer. We flew home right away. Brenda died about 6 months later, just after our 25th birthday. I've never been back to Mont Blanc. The night before he was killed, Martin Luther King Jr., in that famous speech, proclaimed, "I have been to the mountaintop. I have seen the promised land." For him, that view from the top made all the difference in a broken and hurting world, and let me tell you, he was right. The road to Jerusalem is too dark to walk without a vision. The life is too much to live without a Christ. A cross is too much to bear alone. We cannot stay on top of the mountain. But having been there makes all the difference. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.